Safety was once something I imagined matrimony would provide. Such a sentiment might strike a person as peculiar, particularly if they have been raised on the notion that relationships within the Amish community are cold, coerced, or strictly arranged by others. The typical perception involves rigid regulations and miserable partnerships, while the alternative view paints a picture of wholesome, undisturbed households residing in harmony, entirely shielded from modern hardships. The actual reality, however, occupies a space somewhere between those two extremes. Consider the reality of being a 19-year-old who has spent a lifetime fulfilling every single demand placed upon them. You rise well ahead of the dawn, dedicate yourself to grueling labor, and remain utterly silent when your elders are speaking. Suddenly, a singular inquiry begins to echo from every corner, asking when your wedding day will arrive. The question is not prompted by finding a soulmate, but rather by the simple fact that your time has come. When an entire society holds a uniform anticipation, offering a refusal can feel virtually unattainable. I grew up inside this world, specifically within an Old Order Amish settlement located in Ohio. A vast portion of my formative years was dedicated to adhering to traditions that had been handed down through the generations. My education took place inside a single-room schoolhouse, my transportation was a horse-drawn buggy, and I was taught from a very early age that submission to authority held far greater weight than individual desire. These observations do not come from an external observer examining a foreign culture. I truly experienced these restrictions firsthand. I witnessed my peers enter into matrimony, and I eventually walked down the aisle myself, spending a significant period of time convinced that I fully grasped the inner workings of Amish unions. A common misconception is that these unions are entirely orchestrated by parents, while another prevailing belief suggests that the youth possess unrestricted autonomy in choosing a partner. Neither viewpoint accurately captures the full dynamic. The account being shared here diverges from the conventional narrative, focusing instead on the subtle forces operating beneath the communal quiet. Grasping this distinction fundamentally alters how one views the institution of marriage within this culture. Within my specific neighborhood, formal arrangements did not exist, meaning no parental figure handpicked a groom for me, nor did a bishop decree who my partner would be. Even so, true personal agency did not function in the manner outsiders might assume. Every facet of our daily existence was molded by the Ordnung, the comprehensive system of communal principles and behavioral standards. Naturally, matrimonial expectations were governed by these same principles. It was an unwritten law that dating must occur exclusively within the fellowship of the church. Furthermore, it was mutually understood that taking a spouse was the logical step following baptism. A bishop never had to stand over us to demand that we set a wedding date, yet every individual was fully aware of the trajectory they were destined to follow. This pattern became apparent to me long before I reached the age of courtship. Young girls matured into adolescence, those adolescents entered into courtships, engagements inevitably followed, and weddings soon sealed the process. The cycle rolled forward continuously. Instruction was unnecessary because the pressure was woven into the very fabric of our environment. Furthermore, entering into holy matrimony was inextricably linked to one's formal membership in the church. Holy baptism typically takes place during the latter years of adolescence in many Amish circles, and once an individual undergoes this ritual, their accountability to ecclesiastical authority shifts in a highly consequential manner. Walking away from the fold after taking these vows brought severe repercussions, a reality that occupied my thoughts frequently. The process of courtship itself was wrapped in a high degree of privacy compared to contemporary dating practices. Young people generally crossed paths at church services, traditional singings, and shared labor events, allowing bonds to mature gradually, at least on the surface. Beneath that placid exterior lay a weight that is difficult to articulate. A perpetual mindfulness that your ultimate destiny was already being calculated by the community. People observed your actions, took note of your companions, and whispered among themselves. This surveillance was usually rooted in goodwill, but the chatter persisted nonetheless, transforming that ambient expectation into a rule just as binding as any written decree. By the time I turned 18, I began spending time with a young man named Samuel, a soft-spoken, diligent, and highly regarded individual. He possessed the admiration of everyone, earning the endorsement of my parents, the blessing of the congregation, and the approval of the neighbors. I shared those positive feelings, or at least I thoroughly convinced myself that I did. Our interactions predominantly took place in the wake of Sunday services, or occasionally while sharing a buggy ride home after an evening singing. Those winter nights felt incredibly vast, and I can still recall the rhythmic sound of horse hooves pulling through the snow-laden paths while the glow of our lantern danced across the glass. Samuel maintained a polite, unwavering, and gentle demeanor throughout our time together. It is vital to recognize this detail, as this account does not feature a malicious antagonist. For a span of several months, our bond advanced along a trajectory that appeared perfectly standard, prompting the people around us to begin inquiring about our future. The queries started small before growing more direct, such as when my mother mused about whether I envisioned domestic life alongside him. An aunt probed about the timeline for an engagement, while a neighbor offered a knowing smile, mentioning her anticipation of a wedding invitation in the near future. While each remark seemed benign on its own, their collective weight grew increasingly burdensome. I caught myself tracking the passing months, calculating the mounting expectations, and realizing how many onlookers took it for granted that the choice had already been finalized. During a particular summer evening following a community gathering, Samuel and I found ourselves seated outdoors. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of freshly mown hay, and the laughter of playing children drifted from nearby. It was then that he inquired whether we should plan to wed before the year reached its end. A sudden paralysis gripped me, not due to any aversion toward him, but because of the abrupt, terrifying realization that I was entirely unsure of my own desires. That inner vacancy filled me with dread. Having spent a lifetime practicing compliance, I found myself unable to identify my own authentic internal perspective. For several weeks, I attempted to suppress those doubts, rationalizing that hesitation was merely a standard prelude to marriage, and convincing myself that true contentment would blossom after the vows were spoken. Nevertheless, the unease refused to dissipate. During the dark hours, I lay awake absorbing the subtle noises of the household, the creak of a shifting door, footsteps moving on the floor above, the whistling wind outside, while a singular query continuously echoed in my mind. I wondered if the existence laid out before me was truly the one I wished to inhabit, though I kept those anxieties entirely to myself during that period. 4 months subsequent to that conversation, Samuel made his formal proposal on a gray Sunday afternoon in November, when the agricultural field stood stripped and empty. The moment he posed the question, my immediate reaction was to scan my surroundings before offering a reply, a specific memory that remained etched in my mind for years to come. Rather than searching my inner soul, my gaze directed outward toward the heavy expectations, my family, the congregation, and every person who would experience a sense of relief upon hearing an affirmative answer. Yielding to that pressure, I spoke the word he was waiting to hear. The ensuing engagement spanned half a year, a period marked by collective celebration and widespread joy among everyone except myself, as my internal voice grew increasingly faint. 3 weeks prior to the scheduled ceremony, I awoke ahead of the morning light into a completely silent house. Perched on the edge of my mattress, I remained motionless for nearly an hour, lost in the stillness, until a wave of absolute clarity washed over me. I recognized that entering into this union with Samuel would condemn me to a lifetime of trying to justify a decision that I already profoundly questioned. A chill overtook my hands, my stomach knotted tightly, and the sound of my own respiration filled the quiet room. The realization lacked external drama, featuring no explosive arguments or catastrophic events, but rather a singular, unassailable truth. I could not go through with it. That very afternoon, I sought out Samuel in a private setting to inform him that our engagement was over. My delivery was unsteady, and the color drained completely from his face as we stood in a protracted silence. Eventually, he offered a solitary nod of comprehension, and nothing more. The immense wave of liberation that washed over me was instantly accompanied by a profound sense of humiliation and dread. My decision brought deep disappointment to many, left others entirely baffled, and caused a number of individuals to withdraw their communication from me for a duration of time. Yet, for the first time in memory, I was living authentically, an experience that fundamentally reshaped my reality. The true pivot point of my journey was not the mere dissolution of the engagement itself, but rather the internal recognition of why I had come so incredibly close to the altar in the first place. I had inadvertently conflated the affirmation of my community with my own personal desires, an epiphany that surfaced in the absolute stillness of a pre-dawn bedroom. This breakthrough was not engineered by a bishop, dictated by a specific regulation, or caused by any singular person. Instead, it was the decades of cultural conditioning that had so thoroughly dictated my thought processes, leaving me unable to untangle my genuine wishes from the aspirations of the collective group. Once that illusion was shattered, it was impossible to return to my old way of thinking. The most painful realization was acknowledging that this immense pressure had frequently been delivered under the guise of deep affection, a fact that completely altered my perception of my entire past. Reflecting on those years, I do not view Amish matrimony through the distorted lens often held by the modern world. The vast majority of couples within that society possessed a sincere devotion to one another, successfully establishing stable environments and deeply purposeful lives together. Their mutual devotion was entirely authentic. I maintain a deep respect for the core principles that anchored those unions. Fidelity, accountability, mutual service, and the sanctity of kinship held immense gravity for those who embraced them. My critique was never directed at those foundational ideals, but rather at how profoundly difficult it becomes to interrogate communal expectations once they are thoroughly embedded into the rhythm of daily life. A social structure can exert immense pressure even when the participants are acting out of pure kindness, meaning both realities can exist simultaneously. It required years of separation for me to fully synthesize that paradox. The community members possessed no malicious intent toward me, yet I still absolutely required the isolation necessary to decipher my own thoughts. In the end, it is often the quietest internal inquiry that carries the greatest significance. We must look closely at our lives and ask whether we are pursuing a path born of genuine personal conviction or simply following the blueprint we have been conditioned to accept. If this story has caused you to reflect on your own journey, perhaps you might consider passing this narrative along to someone else who might need to hear it, or sharing your own experiences with navigating the weight of expectation.